Professor Armitage is the Lloyd Blankfein Professor of History and, more importantly, Chair of the History Department at Harvard University. He teaches intellectual history and international history. Born across the pond and educated at Cambridge and Princeton, before he eventually arrived at our Cambridge on this side of the Atlantic in 2004, after also teaching at Columbia University. He is a prize-winning teacher and writer, has lectured on 6 continents, and held research fellowships and visiting positions in Britain, France, the United States, and Australia. What we're going to do this morning, as we begin to broaden out from Philadelphia and look at the global world, we figured it would be a good idea to bring one of the foremost experts in the Atlantic world to talk to us today. Professor Armitage is the author or editor of 13 books, among them The Ideological Origins of the British Empire, which won the Longman History Today Book of the Year Award, The Declaration of Independence, A Global History, which will be the basis, which is actually you can see in the young man's hand right there, as well as Shakespeare and Early Modern Political Thought, The Age of Revolutions in Global Context, and Pacific Histories, Ocean, Land, and People. In addition to his own writings and his editing of works, Professor Armitage is actively involved in the larger scholarly world as a syndic of the Harvard University Press and as a member of the editorial board of a variety of journals, and we are very delighted to have him with us today. Professor Armitage, thanks.
Ron is now my new best friend. It's a long time since anybody's called me a young man. Thank you, Ron. I really appreciate that. People sometimes ask me what it's like being chair of a major department like the Harvard History Department, and I refer them to the dictionary definition of a chair, which is a thing upon which everyone sits. Believe me when I say it is a real pleasure to be here this weekend, not only to have some time off for good behavior, but also to meet all of you. There is nothing, truly nothing, I enjoy more than speaking to high school teachers. For many years, I ran a Gilder Lehrman seminar on the Declaration of Independence, and so every summer for 5 days, I'd spend very intensive, extraordinarily rewarding period with people just like you, maybe even some of you in this room, I don't know, on this. It gives me a real delight to be here today. And what I want to do is exactly what Ron said, to bring a global perspective to that most American of documents, the Declaration of Independence, and also make, obviously, a few references to its Philadelphia context as well to bring it into line with the overall theme of this institute this weekend. I'm afraid I'm not in a position to answer the overarching question whether liberal democracy began here by accident or not, but I'll be very interested to hear your answers to this after your immersion in the talks and discussions that you've had this weekend. So let me begin not with a Philadelphian, but someone who spent crucial time here, Thomas Jefferson. 2 weeks before his death on the 4th of July, 1826, Thomas Jefferson offered an expansive vision of the Declaration of Independence, a document he himself, of course, had drafted right here in this city exactly half a century before, in late June, early July 1776. In the letter that I'll quote in a second, he was declining an invitation to attend the commemoration in Washington, D.C. of the 50th anniversary of American independence. In that letter, one of the very last ones he wrote, not quite the very last letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote was to his wine merchant about a shipment of French wine, interestingly. Shows his priorities right at the end. The penultimate letter was about the Declaration. The very last letter he wrote was about wine. I always like that. Anyway, in this penultimate letter, perhaps the most famous letter from his dying days, he called the Declaration, quotes, an instrument pregnant with our own and the fate of the world. He regretted, writing to his potential hosts, that illness would keep him from coming to Washington, D.C. for a reunion with those he called the remnant of that host of worthies who joined with us on that day, July 4th, 1776, in the bold and doubtful election we were to make for our country between submission or the sword. And then he went on that he would have enjoyed with them the consolatory fact that our fellow citizens, after half a century of experience and prosperity, continue to approve the choice we made. May it be to the world what I believe it will be, to some parts sooner, to others later, but finally to all the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. So thinking in a global context to the whole world about the impact of 4th of July 1776 as a moment attached to a particular document and the promises it contained, but also what that moment of American independence meant for the wider world, and he's looking back from that 50-year perspective. The Declaration of Independence may have had special significance for Americans at that point, and it certainly did, but as Jefferson prophesied, its power as a symbol was potentially global in extent. Even during Jefferson's own lifetime, the Declaration had already become something more practical than a symbol, in fact. It provided the model for similar declarations of independence around the world that declared the independence of other peoples and states. Even by the time that Jefferson himself wrote in 1826, the American Declaration had been joined by more than 30 other declarations of independence from Northern and Southern Europe, from the Caribbean, from Central America, and from South America. There are more than 20 declarations of independence after 1810, just in Central America and Spanish America alone. None of those documents would have existed without the model of the American Declaration of Independence. None of the later declarations of independence around the world that I'll refer to later would have existed either. At the moment at which we speak, more than 1/2 of the countries represented at the United Nations have a document that they call a Declaration of Independence. And I'll talk about some of the differences between those documents and the American document in a moment, but the very model, what I call in my book in particular, the very genre of a Declaration of Independence, was undoubtedly invented in June and July 1776. I say this with some regret, I have to say. When I began writing this book some years ago, I was expecting that there would be a whole chapter at the beginning on all the declarations of independence before 1776. I came to this as a British historian, an Atlantic historian. You may have picked up, I'm not an American. I'm going to take American citizenship later this year. But I came to this topic thinking I'm going to smash American exceptionalism. I'm going to have a whole paragraph, a whole chapter about all the other declarations of independence. The first one wasn't invented on the 4th of July. I'm going to take down that myth. But I'm a good enough historian that after a year of searching in the archives and the documents, there are no precedents. There are documents that much later, for example in the late 19th century, get called the Dutch Declaration of Independence, the Scottish Declaration of Independence, the Dutch from the late 16th century, the Scottish from the early 14th century, but they are not declarations of independence. It's only after the enormous impact and the mythologization, in fact, of the American Declaration that these earlier documents come to be called subsequently, but only in the 19th century declarations of independence. This was a great invention here in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. Many of the later documents after 1776 certainly drew directly on the American Declaration for inspiration, for language, for their structure, for the very, again, the genre of a Declaration of Independence itself. They adopted and sometimes adapted specific phrases from the American Declaration, or more often they simply took its general structure, and again I'll talk about that in a moment. The authors of the American Declaration had claimed independence only for themselves. They didn't make a universal claim for every people to gain independence. And they weren't claiming independence on behalf of others. There's an interesting difference here, for instance, between the American document and some of the documents of the French Revolution, which were genuinely universalist, making promises to all people, all peoples around the world. That was not part of the intention in 1776, though it came to be one of the effects. The specific and particular idea of independence that we find in the Declaration would, however, assume near universal significance in the centuries after 1776 as the American example spread around the world. And I'll give a couple examples at the very end of this talk of the ways in which it's still resonating even today in places like Kosovo and South Sudan. Now, every generation, I believe, gets the Declaration of Independence it deserves. Our own global moment in the early 21st century merits a global or globalized history of the Declaration of Independence. Global history, I and my colleagues would say, can be pursued from the outside in to bring universal global perspectives to bear on particular moments, places, persons, or objects. But it can also be written in the other direction, from the inside out, from the local and the specific and the particular to the worldwide and the general. Those two approaches are not, I think, competing, but complementary, and indeed each would be impossible without the other. There's always the dialectic, we might say, between the global and the local, and that's what I want to engage in examining the Declaration this morning. I want to globalize the Declaration for you in both of those ways. First, to see the impact of the wider world on the genesis and the meaning of the Declaration in 1776, and then secondly, to sketch the Declaration's impact on the world, the way in which it helped to shape the world in the decades and then the centuries after 1776. I hope after this brief talk you'll come to agree that the Declaration of Independence cannot but look different when it's put into such a global perspective. And I say that very generally. When I give talks like this to my fellow academics, I say this is a very important sign of what one can do with many aspects of American history, putting it into global context. But I say this very practically to you. I've had a lot of evidence of this for many years of talking to high school teachers about this, that it's a great way to teach the Declaration in your classrooms. And the Declaration is a great document to teach in your classrooms in the context both of AP US history with a larger global context, but also AP world history as well. It's a very short document. It's the kind of thing I often start my own classes. I know other people do the same thing, where you just go around the whole class and read it together and realize what it says, and just to hear the document in multiple voices in your classrooms with your students and yourselves. It's a great way to start any lesson on this. And then to start thinking about what it says, some of the unfamiliar phrases that we don't always put stress on in our imagining of what the document says. And that's what I want to do today, is to put some stress on those phrases, to bring out phrases which you might skip over, or we might skip over when we read it or remember it, but actually tell us a great deal about the international and the global situation in 1776. And then these phrases resonate for a great many other peoples around the world after 1776. And I believe they'll resonate for many of your students as well, in the sense that these global languages, these international languages, now make more sense in the early 21st century than they might have done, say, in the middle of the 20th century. When there were other perspectives, perhaps more national, inward-looking perspectives on both American history and the document itself. Of course, no single document is so bound up with what it means to be American than the Declaration, and few words, we might say, sum up the American creed as succinctly as the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet I want to show now that from its very inception, the Declaration of Independence was bound up with a wider world. The most obvious way to illustrate that is to look at the earliest physical, material forms of the Declaration produced right here in Philadelphia, blocks from where we stand today. So, for example, the earliest form of the document itself was actually the printed form, the John Dunlap broadside that you see reproduced at every historical site, including Independence Hall, was the original version of the document, not the manuscript version. The printed version was the first version, produced over the night of 4th of July and on into the early morning of July 5th by John Dunlap in his print shop at 2nd and Market Street here in Philadelphia, so very close to where we stand now. Who was John Dunlap? He came from Northern Ireland, so in a broad sense he was British. How did he print the document? He printed it on a printing press, but there were no manufacturers of printing presses in the British American colonies at that point, so absolutely certainly his printing press would have been imported from Britain. Where did he get the type? Again, there were no type founders. No one was producing type in the colonies at that point, so his type would almost certainly have come from London. And I think most revealingly of all, where did the paper come from? What later becomes called the United States didn't become self-sufficient in paper manufacture until probably, I think, the second decade of the 19th century. And we can tell from analysis of the surviving copies of the printed version of the Dunlap broadside that he printed all of his copies on Dutch paper. So this is a Northern Irishman who is a British subject using a British printing press with British type, printing the Declaration of Independence on Dutch paper. There was nothing American about that in its physical form. Fast forward a few weeks to the signing of the so-called engrossed copy, that is the manuscript copy, the formal manuscript copy of the Declaration of Independence, signed from late July on into early August. There's no one moment, unlike the famous painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, where everyone comes together to sign it. It's sitting in what we now call Independence Hall, the Pennsylvania Assembly. waiting to be signed as people come through. What do they sign it with? Again, you've been to Independence Hall, you've seen the silver inkstand, the famous silver inkstand with which it's signed. Can anyone tell me where the silver mines were in British North America in the 17th and 18th century? No. That silver, I don't know whether anyone's done an analysis of the silver itself, but it almost certainly came from Mexico or Peru. Originally probably mined in the 16th or 17th centuries. Almost certainly this would be captured silver, which through the circuits of privateering had made its way back into the northern colonies through the Atlantic world. So even again, that mythical object, the original silver inkstand, which was used to sign the Declaration of Independence, would ultimately have come from the Spanish colonies through these illegal circuits. Who made that silver inkstand? Philip Syng, who was himself an Irishman. There were no Americans before July 4th, 1776, and even sometime after that. We can't call them Americans, really. So at this moment, all of this physical evidence right here in Philadelphia of the printing and the signing of the Declaration itself gives us a nice snapshot of the circuits of the Atlantic world, the movement of people and goods, the ways in which all of these cosmopolitan circulations of individuals, of physical goods, came together to create this most American of documents, which is American in no sense, in its physical sense, except possibly the vellum which is used to create the engrossed copy. I think the animal out of which that skin was taken, we maybe call that animal an American by July or August 1776, but certainly the printed version is not. Also, just as a sidebar, the first German translation, the first translation that isn't in any language other than English, took place here in Philadelphia. I think it's on something like the 8th of July, 7th or 8th of July, in one of the German language newspapers here in Philadelphia. The first translation of the Declaration into any language other than English takes place here. So all little bits of evidence about the cosmopolitanism, the circulatory nature, the internationalized nature of the world that the Declaration arises from and then is also addressed to as well. Remember also that of the 55 delegates to Congress who put their signatures to the engrossed manuscript copy you can now see in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., 9 of those 55 had been born in Britain and Ireland, and more than a dozen had been educated abroad in England, Scotland, and in a couple of cases in France as well. So even the signers themselves were a very cosmopolitan bunch from around the Atlantic world, not all of them born here in the colonies, and not therefore natal Americans in the end either. The earliest public versions of the Declaration that arose here in Philadelphia arose at these intersections of politics and printing, the migration of individuals and the movements of goods around an Atlantic world that over the course of the 18th century increasingly linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas into a single economic and cultural system. If traces of the world beyond the North American colonies can be discovered in a document invested with so much significance as an icon of Americanness, then I think similar vestiges can be found throughout the various materials from which American history is built, and this approach can, I think, be expanded for many other aspects of American history. But let's think about the set of events or the process out of which the Declaration arose, what we call the American Revolution, what comes to be called retrospectively the American Revolution. That took place within, and I think was also in large part a product of, a global moment in the late 18th century itself. The generation of Europeans and Americans that came of age in the decades before 1776, and remember this was a young man's revolution. If you do an analysis of the ages of the revolutionaries themselves, their median age is somewhere in their early 30s. It's extraordinary how young almost all of the founding fathers, revolutionaries, and others were, with the exception of Benjamin Franklin, but they're all very, very young. It's a young man's revolution very much. But they came of age in the era after the 7 Years' War. We often call this the First World War, the first war that's fought on all continents between Britain and France for imperial control of the seaways as well as the land that linked together parts of a global empire. And certainly the revolutionary generation here in Philadelphia and in the colonies more generally would have been very well aware of that global context, well aware of it from newspapers, well aware of it from the magazines that circulated across the Atlantic, well aware of it from the major histories that were being written and published in this period, the Abbé Raynal's famous Histoire des deux Indes, the history of the two Indies, the East Indies and the West Indies, linking together the global empires. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, in some ways the longest pamphlet of the American Revolutionary War. If you read the very last page, you only need to read the last page of Smith's Wealth of Nations. It's an attack on the economic rationality of the British Empire and basically says we've got to give this up. We in Britain have to give this up. The empire, particularly the Atlantic Empire, has done nothing for us. It's bled our revenue. It hasn't given us soldiers to defend our global empire. These are the only two reasons to have an empire. Let's give up this global dream. Not at all a coincidence that Smith and his publishers connived to publish the Wealth of Nations to coincide with the opening of Parliament in 1776 to influence MPs as they're debating, as those MPs are debating the rationality and the course of the American war. So not at all a coincidence that that great document comes out. And again, if you read the whole of the Wealth of Nations, you realize that at heart, it's basically an enormous comparative history of European empires put into a long-range context, comparing them to Greek and Roman Empire in particular. So it's a longue durée, long-range meditation on the rationality of empire, directed partly at the East Indies and the East India Company, but also quite centrally to the American War in 1776 as well. And again, just to bring home those connections, the connections between the East Indies and the West Indies, between what we would now call the Indian Ocean arena and the Atlantic Ocean arena, South Asia and America, came home very clearly to participants in the imperial crisis in the 1770s. The fortunes of Virginia planters and Boston merchants were very closely bound up with the fate of the English East India Company in South Asia by great skeins of credit and debt that ran through banks in London and Glasgow, and by circuits of trade that brought China tea in East India Company ships, for example, to Boston Harbor in December 1773 under terms set by Parliament in Westminster. The origins of the American Revolution, and therefore the origins of the document we call now the Declaration of Independence, cannot be fully understood without an appreciation of the worldwide webs within which the colonists were enmeshed in the years running up to 1776. Those thickening global connections and the decisive shifts in the European state system, and also the relations between European states and European overseas companies. Remember, the East India Company is more powerful diplomatically, militarily, fiscally than many European states in this period. It's hard to tell corporations and states apart in the 18th century. Those thickening global connections, the shifts between states and companies in this period, and the balance of power within the Atlantic world they brought in their wake, challenged contemporaries to understand their world in innovative ways. And again, I'm going to show in a moment that the Declaration of Independence is one of these ways of understanding the international balance of power, economic shifts in this period, just as, say, Smith's Wealth of Nations from the same year is an even more sophisticated and, of course, much lengthier attempt to understand some of the same questions that I think resonate very much with us in our own global moment. The Declaration itself, I want to argue, was a crucial symptom of that novel global understanding in 1776. To see why, let's recall what it was that the Declaration actually declared. Its opening and closing paragraphs clearly affirmed the entrance of a new actor, one people, or a set of actors, 13 free and independent states, onto the world stage. The Declaration's very first sentence, and let's recall that first sentence now, the Declaration's very first sentence stated truths about the world so self-evident they apparently needed no justification or elaboration for its readers in 1776. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Packed into that sentence was a set of assumptions about 18th century international politics. The most fundamental was the existence of a group of political bodies, the powers of the earth, that interacted with one another according to certain external rules or norms, the laws of nature and of nature's God. They were entitled to do so, it implied, for two main reasons: because they were separate from, or we might say independent of, one another, and because they were equal in station to each other. The number of those powers of the earth was not closed or fixed, it implied. It could expand to include any people that had been compelled to become separate and thereby wished to claim equal standing with the existing powers. However, like any enlightened public made up of discrete political persons, this community of earthly powers possessed opinions that needed to be informed and respected. Its members therefore communicated with each other formally by means of public documents, such as the Declaration itself. And if we move now quickly to the very concluding paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, we'll see how it enumerated rights, not the rights of individuals, but the rights of states, the rights possessed by those states that had successfully achieved their independence and their equality with the other powers of the earth. And again, just to remind you of the concluding lines of the document. These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. So indeed, the Declaration of Independence is a fundamental rights document, but it's a fundamental document about the rights of states, not the rights of individuals. That's a controversial statement, and I'll come back to one of the major reasons why I think that's an important reading of the Declaration, not least because of the global reception of the Declaration of Independence, which very, very rarely refers to the second paragraph, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but often refers quite frequently to that final paragraph, the rights of states to do all the things that free and independent states may of right do. That list of corporate rights of states was as open-ended as the roster of individual rights found earlier in the Declaration in the second paragraph, which of course famously stated that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was not intended to be an exhaustive list. It's deliberately open-ended and vague, just as the list of rights of states is quite precise, but also open-ended as well. The Declaration specified the powers of states, war and peace, treaty-making and commerce, without foreclosing the need to exercise other similar powers should the need arise on the part of states themselves. With that precise but flexible declaration of rights, the representatives of the United States, as they now turn themselves into, announced that they had left the transnational community of the British Empire to join instead an international community of independent sovereign states. What we call the Declaration of Independence was therefore a declaration of interdependence. By issuing it, Congress showed their respect to the opinions of mankind. They submitted the facts of their case to a candid world, meaning an unprejudiced world, and they pledged to treat the British as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. The Declaration may have spoken on behalf of the representatives and through them, those they represented, but they were not the audience to which I think the text implicitly directed its argument. It has a domestic audience, very obviously, but its first audience, its first intended audience, is the powers of the earth, other representatives of the outside world. And it was intended to shape their opinions. It's a propaganda document in the neutral sense of propagandas, sending seeds upon the waters, explaining a cause, justifying a cause, converting others to the rationality, the logic, the justice of that cause. Urgent international pressures in 1775 and in 1776 had compelled the Continental Congress to issue the Declaration in the early summer of 1776. So just to reel back a few months, in August 1775, you'll remember George III had declared the colonists outside his protection, that is, to be rebels, who were enemies in war. It's a very important reminder that the American Revolution was a civil war fought within the confines of the British Atlantic Empire. I think, that's a very important way of rethinking the so-called American Revolution, not just as an independence movement of one, as it were, pre-existing people demanding their freedom. That people did not exist before 1776. Indeed, there are good arguments among American historians for saying that Americans, as one single people, didn't begin to exist until after the Civil War, what we call the Civil War in the 19th century. It was a civil war, a local civil war in places like South Carolina, but in a general sense it was a civil war within a British community. So even at the point of declaring independence in Jefferson's language, the Declaration still speaks of British brethren. Even in that document, there's still a sense of a division within a common community there. And the second reason I say it's a civil war is because so many people at the time described it as that. You can find so many pamphlets and documents in 1774, 1775, even into 1776, talking about a civil war, even up to and including the Olive Branch Petition, which ends by saying we're putting this forward in order to prevent or to end this civil war in the British Empire. And there are even people in this period, I think 1775 is the latest I've found, who talk about this as the American Civil War. So that's the first American Civil War. Alan Taylor's recently argued the War of 1812 was also a civil war. So when you get to what you call the Civil War in the 1860s, that's probably the third American Civil War, in fact, just to complicate matters a little bit. But it raises really interesting questions about the nature of the conflict itself and how both sides perceived each other, and also to understand the passions in this conflict, that it's, as it were, an intrafamilial conflict, a conflict within a single community, not the conflict of repressed Americans trying to burst out, having been oppressed by something alien. It's much more complicated, much more poignant, and therefore much more painful than that. However, thinking about this, as it were, in legal terms, especially international legal terms in the 18th century, it was crucial by July 1776 for the rebellious colonists, as I will persist in calling them as a Brit for the moment, for the rebellious colonists to legitimate themselves in the eyes of the world. They had to create the structures within which they could gain recognition, and having gained recognition, gain very practical aid in the form of commerce, men, materiel, diplomatic support for their cause. They could only do that if they had some vestige of independent legitimacy within the international community of the Atlantic world and among the powers of the earth in July 1776. So à l'outrance, at this crucial moment in July 1776, the Declaration of Independence is intended precisely to do that, to make a plea for recognition, to make a plea for interdependence with the other powers of the earth, to gain much needed, absolutely critical support for the cause itself. And they could only do that by presenting themselves as legitimate belligerents outside the British Empire, outside the circuit of the British monarchy, and therefore not to be rebels anymore, but independent states or their representatives with whom others could then treat legitimately, enter into treaties, enter into support, enter into military alliances at that point. The most famous statement of these arguments, again, comes from right here in Philadelphia in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, written in January 1776 here in this city, where he talked about the contemporary custom of nations and argued that only independence would permit a mediator to negotiate peace between the United States and Great Britain at the end of the conflict, that foreign alliances could not be secured without independence, and that charges of rebellion would continue to persist if the colonists did not declare themselves independent. Moreover, he argued in Common Sense, it was essential for, quotes, a manifesto to be published and dispatched to foreign courts. Until that such a manifesto explaining and justifying the cause had been sent to foreign courts, he said, the custom of all those courts is against us and will be so until by an independence we take rank with other nations. Very crisp and really pivotal argument in favor of declaring independence early in 1776. The heart of the Declaration, the longest part of the Declaration, which we usually skip over, is of course, the list of grievances. That's what Paine would have called the manifesto in the terms of 18th century diplomatic language. You lay out your case. You put facts before mankind to shape their opinions. So that history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states, is the charge sheet against George III in particular. Of course, it's very personalized onto the king himself by this point. It was also the culmination of a theory of global conspiracy that had been unfolding across Congress's other state papers since 1774. I won't give you many examples of this, but a good one is from the letter that the Congress wrote to the Jamaica Assembly, trying to get the white planter elite of Jamaica onto their side in 1775, where they talked about a truly global conspiracy by the British Crown and the King's ministers. In the East Indies, they said, where the effeminacy of the inhabitants promised an easy conquest, they thought it unnecessary to veil their tyrannic principles under the thinnest disguise. Within Britain itself, where the maxims of freedom were still known, but where luxury and dissipation had diminished the wonted reverence for them, the attack had been carried on in a more secret and indirect manner. Corruption had been employed to undermine them. The Americans were not enervated by effeminacy like the inhabitants of India, nor debauched by luxury like those of Great Britain. It was therefore judged improper to assail them by bribery or by undisguised force. And then they run through some of the same charges that will recur a few months later in the Declaration of Independence itself. But seeing this as a worldwide conspiracy, that the Crown and its agents are undermining people in South Asia. They're doing the same thing in Britain. They're doing the same thing in the American colonies. This is the kind of global worldview which is very much in the background also of the Declaration itself. One of the most common charges that you can find across the pamphlet literature in the 1770s is the idea that liberty across a global stage is in retreat, and that the American cause is just one more symptom of the retreat of liberty, the contraction of liberty. It had been expanding for some time, often since the Reformation, these arguments run, but since the middle of the 18th century, especially in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, liberty itself was on the defensive, being pushed back into a few redoubts, something that Paine, again, classically says in Common Sense, "O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny, but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted around the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her a warning to depart. O receive the fugitive, and prepare in time an asylum for mankind in America." It's one of his most rousing arguments in favor of independence, that if the British colonies can become independent, they can provide a kind of asylum for the rest of mankind, that freedom hunted around the globe can find protection, can nourish itself, and then project itself against the forces of tyranny around the globe. And again, we'd have to ask, why would Paine think that was a persuasive strategy for his readers in Philadelphia in the colonies? Because he and his contemporaries shared this global vision, as we do as well, about the play of forces, freedom and tyranny around the world. It's not purely rhetorical. Nothing is purely rhetorical, of course, in the 18th century, but it's meant to be a persuasive appeal to this global context, to energize a local cause and put it into a genuinely universal framework. I believe that the authors of the Declaration would have shared that vision, and we can see this unfolding through the charge sheet in the middle of the document. If you read through the list of grievances, and I won't go through the whole thing, you can see it starting from the local and moving out to the universal. Begins with grievances like the holding of public records in particular colonies, the holding of public meetings, in particular the meetings of the Continental Congress, and forcing them to move around. Quite local things, though no names are ever specified. Of course, it's universalized among the colonies. No names, no dates, no pact drill, but it's to bring all of the colonists on board together to imagine specific grievances in Massachusetts, for instance, as being generalized to all the colonies. But as you read through the list of grievances, it starts talking about cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offences, abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighbouring province, that's in Quebec. And as the charges mount rhetorically to their crescendo through the course of the bulk of the Declaration of Independence, the last group, the climactic group of charges, goes outward from the purview of domestic administration and colonial legislation into the realm of what would have been called at the time the law of nations, or what we would call international law. So some of those final charges are, for example, the king has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, destroyed the lives of our people. He was importing foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He had forced our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to take arms against their own countrymen, excited domestic insurrections among us, and endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished declaration of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Not a coincidence, just as a brief sidebar, that there is almost no use of the Declaration of Independence or its language among Native Americans until the 1960s in the US, largely because of that sentence, which is obviously very prejudicial view of Native Americans at that point. The British people provided no defense against these depredations because they would, quotes, they would not disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence, that is, inevitably cut off the colonies from all kinds of commerce with the wider world. Now, you'll remember in Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration that actually the final charge against the king himself had made an even more explicit appeal to the law of nations and the norms of contemporary European civilization. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him. These are the enslaved coming from Africa, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere or to incur miserable death in their transportation here to America. This piratical warfare, this opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of a Christian king of Great Britain, dripping with irony, of course. And that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he, George, is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he deprived them by murdering the people upon whom he also has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against another. And in the midst of that, Jefferson's comparing George III to a pirate, I think probably to the Mediterranean corsairs at the time. One of the big issues, in fact, in the first Franco-American treaty was the protection of American shipping in the Mediterranean from the Barbary pirates that, having, as it were, come out from under the security umbrella of the British Royal Navy in 1776, they needed the protection of another major European power in the Mediterranean arena. But that lies behind, I think, some of Jefferson's metaphors here. This piratical warfare against enslaved Africans by the king is like the piratical warfare of the Barbary corsairs against British, later American shipping as well, in places like Morocco and Algiers, for example. So those charges, struck out, of course, from the final version of the Declaration of Independence, were meant to be the climax of the charge sheet because they were offenses against the law of nations. This was uncivilized, barbarous, piratical activity by the king himself. We can talk about all the reasons why this is, at the very least, inconsistent, at the very most hypocritical on the part of Jefferson to attack the slave trade at this point, but really interesting metaphors which, as it were, seal the deal on the king's tyranny by saying, well, he's done all of these things against domestic law, he's done all these things against the law, colonial law, but most barbarous of all, he's offended against the law of nations, the law of nature and of nature's God, the norms that regulate all of the relations between peoples. And it's also fascinating that in that passage, Jefferson speaks of life and liberty and one people. The only other place in the document where they talk about one people are the people of the colonies separating themselves. There may be an implicit argument, oddly, in that excised passage for the Africans, the enslaved Africans, as another people who might even logically be able to claim their independence to separate from another people because of tyranny as well. So all very fascinating implications in that. So just to conclude this part of the reading of the document itself, the wider world imagined in the Declaration, in its language, its explicit appeals, and also in its drafts, was a world of peoples linked by both benign and malign forms of commerce. It was an arena of warfare between Americans and Britons, as well as among their various allies and enemies. It was populated mostly by mutually recognizing sovereign states, but it was also threatened by outlaw powers who acted more like pirates, those traditional enemies of humankind engaged in warfare against humanity itself. This, we might say, is a recognizably modern world in which commerce and war are the most conspicuous forms of interaction between different peoples and states, and also corporations, of course. Even among European thinkers, however, that conception of interactions between states was about barely a century old in 1776. And I could talk more about that from other work I've done on the origins of these international visions in the 18th century. But it was also a world in which metaphysical norms, the laws of nature and of nature's God, could still be appealed to, alongside the known rules of warfare and cultural standards like civility and barbarism. So the Declaration of Independence, just to recap, announced an intention to enter the international system on equal terms with the other powers of the earth, a declaration of interdependence in that sense. The United States was now available to allies and open for business. The primary intention behind the declaration had been to affirm before world opinion the rights of one people organized into 13 states to enter the international arena on a footing similar to other equal, mutually recognizing independent states. The authors of the Declaration sought the admission of the United States of America to a pre-existing international order, and that term United States of America appears for the first time publicly in this document. It's crucial. I'll come back to that in conclusion in just a moment. They couched their appeal to the powers of the earth in terms that those powers would understand. The very language of the document, I can show elsewhere, comes from the most respected contemporary compendium of the law of nations, which we know that they had on their desk literally in the Second Continental Congress, referring to it for the right language to make sure it fit with prevailing international and diplomatic norms. As John Adams, and I could reproduce many other similar quotations from the same period, John Adams, writing in 1781, noted, the Declaration was, quotes, that memorable act by which the United States assumed an equal station among the nations. That would be the most common understanding among white Americans, at least, of the Declaration's primary meaning until the 1830s. I say white Americans because the only people, and it's a very significant group of people, who pay attention to the second paragraph, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the promises of equality, etc., are African Americans. As early as August 1776, we can find an African American preacher in Connecticut reading the Second Declaration of Independence as an abolitionist document, and that becomes one of the key readings of the document in the African American community. But I can tell you, having, for instance, gone through all the debates on the Constitution, I think there are maybe 2 references to the Declaration of Independence in the records of the debates on the ratification of the Constitution, the formal, the central debates on that. It's not, once independence is achieved and once it's recognized by Britain in 1783, the Declaration of Independence as such is pretty much a dead letter until after the War of 1812, when it comes back into circulation. It becomes part of American scripture, as the late, great Pauline Maier described it in her marvelous book on the Declaration of Independence, becomes mythologized, gets printed, gets put on people's walls, gets turned into tea towels and scarves and all of these sorts of things, becomes part of the public culture as a visual object, but also as a mythological document. But that does not happen until about 1815, and there are many reasons for that. But by and large, the second paragraph is only of energizing interest to African Americans in this period. For others, like Adams, and Jefferson says the same thing. For instance, Franklin says something quite similar. The Declaration of Independence was the act of entering into, the act that helped the U.S. enter into the international system. As even Abraham Lincoln admitted in 1857, quotes, the assertion that all men are created equal was of no practical use in effecting our separation from Great Britain. It was placed in the Declaration not for that practical purpose in 1776, but for future use, a kind of ticking time bomb that would go off later, in Lincoln's understanding at least. The Declaration would indeed have been a document without a future if it had failed in its central purpose of declaring independence or interdependence. Had it been entirely ignored, as by many at the time it was in fact, had its fundamental claims been decisively refuted, and there were those who attempted to do this, including the young Jeremy Bentham, who you may have heard of in other contexts. He's a paid hand, a hired hack for the British government in 1776, who writes the official response to the Declaration, absolutely withering philosophical attack on the Declaration. Reproduced in my book. Had American independence more practically been nipped in the bud by British military force, as it could very well have been in 1776 even then few might recall the supposedly self-evident truths of the document, as many other failed declarations of independence were subsequently forgotten. These gloomy conclusions about the long-term life of the Declaration can be somewhat reinforced by the history of the reception of the document soon after 1776. Reports of American independence as a fact began immediately traveling across the Atlantic Ocean and then deep into continental Europe in the summer and autumn of 1776. Only 2 months after Congress had passed its resolution on July 2nd, word of independence had reached as far east as Warsaw. So within 2 months, that resolution had been heard of in Warsaw. We think of this as quite remarkable, but speed of communication, even deep into Central Europe, was pretty fast in this period. And the itinerary of the news illustrated that remarkable speed of communications in the late 18th century. We can track very nicely, I'm sorry I don't have a map for you, how word spread first to London, from there to Scotland, Ireland, and Holland, before it gets carried from Holland to the German lands, Scandinavia, and southern and eastern Europe in the space of barely 8 weeks. And as it's moving around through the circuits of news, through diplomatic and especially commercial circles, it pops up in newspapers in France, in the Low Countries, in Denmark, sometimes with snippets of translation of the document, but usually just the American colonies, the British American colonies have declared their independence, and you can track it on its way there. But I think most historians would say it's not the document itself which affects the pivotal turning point in the War of Independence at that point, though it's very important in shaping public opinion in Europe, but we'll probably argue that it's military changes in the military balance of power in the colonies which really help to push forward the cause of independence in this period. But I think it is important to track the itinerary of the document, the way in which it's used as a propaganda document, but also some of the failings as well. A copy is immediately given to Silas Deane, who is the the representative of Congress at the French court, to take across the Atlantic. He loses it. So he has to write back and say, I'm sorry, I lost this. Can you send me another one so I can give that to the French court? It ultimately gets there, but by the time it arrives officially, as it were, in his diplomatic pouch, there'd already been 2 French translations in the French press of the document itself. There's a lot of interest, for obvious reasons, in France at this point, and the key ally, of course, that the colonists want is the French, to support them militarily, diplomatically, but also commercially, and therefore the first major treaty signed by the new United States is the Franco-American Treaty of amity and commerce in that period, which is a crucial turning point in at least the unofficial recognition. According to the law of nations in the 18th century, it was not possible for a third party formally to recognize a rebellious group that had declared independence. It was only possible for the second party, the other party, Britain, to put the seal on that. But there's a very interesting debate about how those norms are changing because of the Declaration of Independence and because of the Franco-American Treaty, which we could talk about. These norms are still somewhat in flux even today. And if we want to declare our independence as a group now, of course the United Nations wouldn't be begging us to come down to New York tomorrow to join it. There's a very complicated process to gain admission, which I'll talk about just very briefly in conclusion in relation to something like Kosovo, for instance, which is in a state of weird suspension, having declared independence, become a UN protectorate, but is not a full member of the United Nations, even though it's a member of many other international organizations. So if we move from 1776 extremely rapidly up to the present, put on your seatbelt, it's going to be a very rapid ride in the next 10 or 15 minutes to go from 1776 up to the present, we can see that the American Revolution was the first outbreak of what I've called a contagion of sovereignty that swept the world in the centuries since 1776. Declarations of independence were among the primary symptoms of that contagion. Its influence spread first to the Low Countries, and then to the Caribbean, Spanish America, the Balkans, Africa, and Central Europe in the decades up to about 1848. The infection then lay dormant for much of the late 19th century until the First World War, when the collapse of the great land empires, for example, of the Ottomans, the Romanovs, and the Habsburgs, led to an outpouring of demands for self-determination, and that language is obviously used in the period after the First World War under the influence of Wilsonianism. An outpouring of demands for self-determination from the Balkans to Korea. The next pandemic sprang up in Asia and Africa after the Second World War and lasted until the zenith of decolonization around 1975. That moment, that latter moment, is the first and still ongoing truly global rights moment in world history, the moment we still inhabit in some sense. Some 70 new states were created during the period of decolonization, mostly in Africa and Asia, mostly, of course, from the wreckage of the British, French, and Portuguese overseas empires, and often with the accompaniment of a Declaration of Independence, but sometimes with other international instruments or sometimes domestic instruments as well to declare those breaks. Later outbreaks of the contagion of sovereignty around the Baltic, in the Balkans, and in Eastern Europe after 1989 and 1991 culminated in the dissolutions of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia after 1990 to 93, giving rise to more than 30 new states, accompanied by the greatest concentration of declarations of independence in world history in that period, 1990 to 93, even more than the huge explosion of declarations of independence that takes place in Spanish America after 1810. For a few years after 1993, there was a period of more general remission in this contagion of sovereignty, but declaring independence has returned since 2006, when Montenegro, one of the last parts of the collapsed Yugoslavia, declared its independence, and since then we've had a declaration of independence from Kosovo in 2010, and then from South Sudan in 2011. When I wrote this book in 2006, published in 2007, I ended with a somewhat gloomy conclusion, effectively predicting that the age of declaring independence was over. The moral of the story to historians is never predict the future, because we had more declarations of independence since then. Or actually, as they used to say in the Soviet Union, the past is unpredictable. Past is unpredictable. You never know what the past is going to do to you. You certainly don't know what the future is going to do to you. So I'm here to withdraw that and then tell you a little bit about recent declarations of independence after this mad run through the last couple of centuries. The first Declaration of Independence, to imitate directly the American Declaration of Independence, comes from Vermont, oddly, what we now call Vermont. In 1777, the New Hampshire grants leave the former colony, now new state, of New York, declare their independence with a declaration modeled after the American Declaration. They don't come back into the Union till somewhat later. Some of you may know there's been a second Vermont Republic in recent years, a very interesting mixture of anxiety about peak oil, later anxiety about the Iraq War. As it turned out in the latter parts of the movement, some bizarre white supremacist connections there as well. One of my students did a marvelous senior thesis on the Second Vermont Republic. Very, very interesting, not least because they go back to this early period of independence outside the United States before they rejoin in the 1780s. The next Declaration of Independence, imitating the American one, is from Flanders in the Low Countries in 1790. I won't go into detail on this, except there's a French translation of the Declaration which is circulating. The Flemish estates breaking away from the empire of the Austrian Emperor Joseph II at this point reach for that French translation and use it to model their own Declaration of Independence. The third Declaration of Independence is probably one most of you have heard of, which is the Haitian Declaration of Independence of January 1804. You'll see in the New York Times a couple of years ago, a graduate student at Duke University doing her dissertation research in the National Archives in London discovered the one surviving printed copy of the Haitian Declaration of Independence. This is the kind of thing that not just every graduate student, but every professor dreams of, finding the one surviving copy of one of the most important documents in modern world history. Pretty amazing, pretty amazing. I've had the privilege recently of writing an essay with her on the Haitian Declaration of Independence. But that's often taken to be the first one after 1776, but I just wanted to fill in the other connections there. Certainly the American Declaration was known in Haiti. There's a lost version of the Haitian Declaration of Independence we know from other reports about the process of its writing, which was patterned quite directly on the American Declaration. But Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the African-born, formerly enslaved free black leader of the forces in Haiti, said, "This is simply not powerful enough. This is not the document we need at this point. Write me another one," he says to his secretary, who does that. And Dessalines is reported as having said, to draw up the act of our independence, we need the skin of a white man for parchment, his skull for an inkwell, his blood for ink, and a bayonet for a pen. And if you read the Haitian Declaration of Independence, again, I have it reproduced in English translation here, it is a very, very fiery document. There is no pretense that the French are still like British brethren in the American Declaration. It's the exact opposite. And they are wolves, they are tigers, they must be killed, all connection must be severed with them. The reason for that is perfectly obvious. If the French managed to defeat Dessalines and his troops in Haiti, it would mean not just the loss of independence for the Haitian community, it would mean the loss of individual independence and the re-enslavement of all the members of that community. So there's a very, very high stakes game going on late 1803, early 1804, when the Declaration is declared in Haiti itself. So the American Declaration is just too passionless, too norm-driven, too close to the bloodless norms of international law, the law of nations at that point, to be useful there. Moving fast forward, I've already mentioned very briefly the proliferation, the explosion of declarations of independence that takes place in Spanish America. After the Napoleonic invasion of Spain, as you know, the Spanish Empire implodes, needs to reorganize sovereignty, various different communities, often at very local levels of cities or towns or even smaller groups, reclaim their sovereignty, reclaim their independence, and then try to reorganize sovereignty once central power in Spain over the empire has been reorganized. And in the context of that, there's a huge explosion of local declarations of independence, which then sort of move up the chain to become, by 1812, 1815, and then onwards actually into the 1830s, rippling through former Spanish America in Central and South America, what we would think of as declarations of independence on behalf of new countries, sometimes new empires, sometimes new monarchies, sometimes new republics, the whole set of different forms there. But by about 1838, I think there are something like 50 declarations of independence, maybe more than that, in fact, though they're still being discovered in local archives in former Spanish America. Some of them patterned very directly after the American Declaration, such as the Venezuelan Declaration of Independence of July 1811, 5th of July 1811, not a coincidence, they wanted to. Promulgated on the 4th of July to rhyme with the American Declaration, but it was raining that day, so they waited till the 5th of July. Ran up a flag patterned after the French tricolor to buy into the prestige of the French Revolution, but doing it on the 5th, close enough to the 4th of July, also buying into the prestige of the success of the American Revolution as well, and quoting some of the same kinds of language there. I could go through many other examples. The Texas Declaration of 1836, the Anglo settlers in Texas, very strongly patterned, again, for very obvious reasons, after the American Declaration, partly because it was making a claim to protection by the US government. So it's a flattering use of the language to appeal to the US at that point, but also using by that point, by 1836, the pretty well-established norms, the pretty well-established language, the pretty well-established genre of a Declaration of Independence. One could add to this the Liberian Declaration of Independence of 1847, free blacks in Liberia, again making an appeal for protection in the international world, using the language of the Declaration of Independence. But that's one of the very few declarations that uses the language of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, again because it's coming out of free African-American communities. So there's a longer history of the use of that language, which they're animating. And I think it's also the only Declaration of Independence which specifies life, liberty, happiness, and property. And property. That does not occur, obviously, in the American Declaration, doesn't occur in any of the drafts of the Declaration. I have to say this because I think it's one of the myths that property was in there and it was struck out. It's not there in any of the drafts. It's not even there in John Locke's version of the similar language as well. But it's there in the Liberian Declaration of Independence, again, for the very crucial reason that many of those who founded Liberia had themselves, at an earlier point in their lives, been the property of others. So their claim to property is a claim to their individual independence. It's also The flip side of this, interestingly, is their claim to property and sovereignty in the land of Liberia against those from whom they had taken that land. It's a land grab against native Africans as well, so it's not a purely liberatory settlement, Liberia, let's say. It is another part of classic 19th century colonialism, but done by free blacks. In this case, and they have some very disparaging things to say about the ignorant Africans among whom they find themselves, to whom they're bringing the light of Christianity, for instance. And so one could run through many more examples, but it's something I was genuinely surprised by when I was doing this research. I expected to find a very large number of these declarations of independence in the second half of the 19th century. Why might I have thought that? Because your standard textbook sentence on the latter part of the 19th century is it's the great age of nationalism. The great age of national self-assertion, romanticism, driving communities to find their own identities, recover their languages, create epics and histories to assert their own independence among other peoples. What that does not relate to, however, is an explosion of declarations of independence. Many of those, if not most of the most significant nationalist movements of the late 19th century, think of Germany, think of Italy, among the most spectacular, are actually about unification and consolidation, not about fragmentation. And fragmentation is really what declarations of independence are about, taking fragments of larger units, especially empires, and then breaking them down. So very few declarations of independence then, but a huge explosion. The next huge explosion is after the First World War. I'll just give you a couple examples here, and not least because one of them relates very directly to where we stand now. Perhaps the most famous declaration of independence from this period is the Declaration of Independence of the Czechoslovak nation of October 1918. Drafted originally in Washington, D.C. Among the drafters is Gutzon Borglum, whom you'll recognize as the sculptor of Mount Rushmore. And once they've drafted and ratified the document, where do they bring it? They bring it to Independence Hall. What do they do when they get to Independence Hall? They sign the Czechoslovak Declaration with the silver inkstand that had been used to sign the original declaration. So the kind of prestige of Independence Hall in that moment is being pulled into that nationalist movement after the First World War. Many other similar declarations from Korea, the March 1st movement in 1919. There's an Estonian declaration, the first of two declarations from Estonia in March 1919. Fast forward after the Second World War, again, a period of the collapse and reorganization of empires, and most of these declarations do come out of collapsing empires. The most famous one is Ho Chi Minh's Vietnamese Declaration of Independence of 1945. Partly at that point, of course, making a claim to American protection for his cause, and therefore Ho had spoken to quite closely a representative of the OSS who was in Hanoi at the time to make sure he got the right translation of the American Declaration. Those of you who follow blogs as time-wastingly as I do, may have seen the controversy a few weeks ago about President Obama making a reference to Ho Chi Minh as a great admirer of George Washington and the Declaration of Independence and the Founding Fathers, and a huge conservative backlash against that, saying Obama's making this up. Obama was not making this up. We have all the documentation, and the first crucial part of the documentation is that the very beginning of the Vietnamese Declaration is the opening lines of the second paragraph of the U.S. Declaration. That's pretty undeniable as an influence, and we know that Ho was a great admirer of Washington, thought of himself as the Vietnamese Washington, etc., etc., etc. One of the key examples of a direct use of the language of the Declaration, but in case, very interestingly, not for individual equality or freedom or life or pursuit of happiness, but rather for the collective pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Vietnamese people have a right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, not individual Vietnamese. So again, very interesting nuance on the reception of the document itself. I won't go through other examples. A very interesting one that one could look at is the Rhodesian Unilateral Declaration of Independence of 1965, which I think is the 20th century document most directly patterned after the American Declaration. A claim by the white minority government of southern Rhodesia against the British government of the time to their independence, that is, a lack of interference from the British Parliament. It's weird because it uses all the language of the American Declaration, very slightly updated for 1965, and then ends "God Save the Queen." Isn't in quite the spirit, somehow, of the American Declaration. I know I'm running over time, but I have to share this. When I was looking for background documentation on this in the National Archives in London, I found an amazing, recently declassified file from 1963 of the military preparation plans that the then British government had made for an invasion in the contingency that the Southern Rhodesian government would declare their independence. And some elephant-minded, historically minded British civil servant had taken this document, it's all about the tanks and the planes and so on that we needed to invade Rhodesia, and had put on the front, "Boston Tea Party." So never underestimate the long historical memory of the British civil service in that way. But very interestingly, I mean, you could flip that around and say, in what sense was the American War of Independence a white settler revolt in the same way that, or at least a parallel to the Unilateral Declaration of Independence in 1965 was a white settler revolt, very different balance of populations, obviously, but some interesting questions that arise there. So as I said, when I was initially putting this material together in 2006, 2007, I thought the age of declaring independence was over, that it was history, as my students would say, and therefore I could write the history of it. Completely disconfirmed. 2006, Montenegro declares its independence. 2010, 2008, Kosovo declares its independence. That goes to the International Court of Justice. In 2010, where there's a really interesting international law debate about the status of declarations of independence, what force they have, how they're recognized, what their legal standing is. I was particularly interested in that. My one moment of global fame was that my book was cited in some of the submissions to the ICJ as historical understanding of how declarations of independence had been unfolded. And then the most recent one, at least the most recent active one, is the Declaration of Independence of South Sudan from 2011. If I had brought more materials with you, I could show the independence celebrations in the stadium in South Sudan where that was promulgated. Of course, not a happy story. Not a happy story for Kosovo, still in suspension, but a really unhappy story, of course, in South Sudan with the civil war that breaks out there as well. So, in brief, what's the moral of the story? I have two morals here about the Declaration of Independence itself. The first was that we should think of the Declaration of Independence as a declaration of interdependence, but also as the birth certificate of the United States of America. If you look at the Dunlap broadside, the only part of the main text of the document in capitals are the two phrases, free and independent states and United States of America. Those are meant to be equivalent, mutually reinforcing, but also announcing something new, a new power of the earth among the other powers of the earth. And ditto, if you look at, squint at, peer at the engrossed manuscript version in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., you can just about make out the faded text where a different hand, an italic hand, is used to highlight those two key terms. That, I think, is the main message of the Declaration of Independence, of the Declaration, that these United States of America were free and independent states. That's what they wanted visually to stand out from these earliest versions. The second moral in conclusion is that it's the first Declaration of Independence, and it begins this contagion of sovereignty. Every part of the earth, except for Antarctica, is now claimed by one state or another. Every human being on Earth is at least potentially the citizen, or in some cases the subject, of one state or another, except for those unfortunate people we call stateless persons and the penguins of Antarctica. Antarctica now has frozen sovereignty, so it's the one part of the Earth that isn't claimed by states, and the only states of exception to that larger claim about the universal blanketing of the earth by states are those states of exception created by states themselves, like Guantanamo Bay, the kind of black holes in the universalization of territorial sovereignty. That process, what I've called elsewhere a move from a world of empires in the 18th century to the universal world of states that we now inhabit, begins in 1776, begins with the Declaration of Independence, that universal spread of statehood as against empire, begins with that document. And I think that's the most significant thing about the Declaration of Independence. It's pretty significant, I think even I would admit, for American history. But I think it's even more significant for global history. So that's my concluding message. I'm very open to questions and comments. Thank you so much for your attention.